On January 12, 2026, the world was jolted awake by a stunning White House announcement. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., a sense of unease rippled across continents. News outlets scrambled to interpret the gravity of what was unfolding, and financial markets from Tokyo to London reacted, with immediate volatility reflecting the uncertainty gripping the globe. President Donald Trump, standing before a sea of reporters, declared that the United States would begin the process of annexing Greenland. He cited reasons of national security, emphasizing the island's strategic location in the Arctic, and pointed to its vast, untapped mineral wealth as vital to America's future. The announcement was delivered with characteristic bluntness, leaving little room for ambiguity or negotiation. The message was unmistakable. If Denmark, the sovereign nation overseeing Greenland, refused to cooperate, the United States was prepared to use force. This unprecedented ultimatum sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles as the world grappled with the possibility of military confrontation in the Arctic, a region long considered a frontier of peaceful cooperation. Europe's capitals erupted in disbelief and condemnation. Overnight, city streets filled with anxious citizens glued to their screens, while spontaneous protests broke out outside American embassies. The sense of security that had defined the post-war era seemed to evaporate in an instant. Denmark's prime minister, visibly shaken, called the move an unthinkable violation of sovereignty and international law. Within hours, EU leaders convened an emergency summit in Brussels, standing shoulder to shoulder with Denmark and warning that such aggression would have dire and far-reaching consequences for transatlantic relations. The Transatlantic alliance, built on NATO's promise of collective defense, now faced its gravest crisis since its founding. For decades, the United States had been the bedrock of European security, but now, the protector had become the aggressor. The very foundation of trust and mutual defense was suddenly in question, leaving allies uncertain and divided. European leaders scrambled to respond, torn between the imperative to defend a close partner and the terrifying prospect of open conflict with the world's most powerful military. Behind closed doors, governments weighed their options, debating whether to confront the U.S. directly or seek a diplomatic off-ramp to avoid catastrophe. The fate of Greenland now symbolized more than just territorial control. It became a test of the Western alliance's unity and the principles of sovereignty, democracy, and international order that have underpinned global stability for nearly 80 years. The world watched as the crisis deepened, wondering if the values forged in the aftermath of World War II would endure. The choices made in the coming days would not only determine Greenland's future, but would also redefine Europe's role on the world stage and reshape the global balance of power for generations to come. The world stood at a crossroads, with history hanging in the balance. Europe faced a stark dilemma: retaliate against the US and risk escalation, or do nothing and watch the rules-based order unravel. Interventionists argued that failing to act would render NATO meaningless and embolden future aggressors. Pragmatists warned that Europe's economic and military ties to the US made confrontation self-destructive, urging diplomacy instead. The continent's reliance on American security complicated every option, forcing leaders to weigh principle against peril. The wrong move could mean either subjugation or catastrophic conflict. The case for a strong European response was rooted in defending international law and sovereignty. Allowing the US to seize Greenland by force would shatter the post-war order and set a precedent for global lawlessness. Europe's support for Ukraine hinged on the same principle. Borders cannot be changed by aggression. If Europe stood by, its credibility and the NATO alliance would be fatally undermined. The security guarantee of Article 5 would be exposed as hollow, leaving all members vulnerable. Retaliation, though risky, was seen as essential for Europe's self-preservation and strategic autonomy. The world was watching to see if Europe would defend its own rules. Yet, pragmatists warned that direct confrontation with the US would be disastrous. America's military dominance and economic ties to Europe meant any military or trade war would devastate both sides. Severing the transatlantic relationship would leave Europe isolated, without US intelligence, nuclear protection, or global influence. Internal divisions within the EU further complicated unity. Some nations feared antagonizing Washington more than losing Greenland. The argument for restraint was not appeasement but a sober calculation of risks and limits. Europe's challenge: respond forcefully without self-destruction. The stakes had never been higher. European leaders considered lessons from China's approach to US pressure: patient, asymmetric, and economic rather than military. But Europe, a union of democracies, couldn't simply copy China's model. The US-Europe relationship was built on alliance, not rivalry, making a full decoupling unthinkable for many. China's strategy avoided war but fueled global instability. Europe needed a hybrid approach. Immediate condemnation and targeted sanctions, combined with a long-term push for strategic autonomy, emerged as the likely path. The crisis demanded both resolve and patience. A military response, while risky, could serve as a powerful symbol of European resolve. Deploying a multinational naval task force near Greenland would signal unity and opposition, complicating US operations. Such a move would be more about deterrence than confrontation. But the risk of escalation was real. Coordinating a rapid joint deployment would test Europe's political and military cohesion. The presence of European warships could force Washington to reconsider, but a miscalculation could trigger disaster. This option was a last resort, potent but perilous. Europe had to weigh symbolism against the risk of war. Europe's true leverage lay in its economic might. The EU could trigger the anti-coercion instrument, imposing tariffs and restrictions to punish US aggression. A coordinated sell-off of US Treasury bonds could rattle American markets, but would also hurt Europe, and risk global financial chaos. Economic warfare would inflict pain on both sides, but avoided immediate bloodshed. Sanctions and tariffs could be scaled, offering Washington a way to de-escalate. Yet, a trade war would devastate European exporters and investors, demanding resolve to endure short-term pain for long-term principle. The decision to use these tools would test Europe's unity and resolve. Economic power was a double-edged sword. In the tense diplomatic climate, Europe's primary objective was to diplomatically isolate the United States on the world stage. European leaders recognized that direct confrontation would be risky, so instead, they sought to use the power of international institutions and alliances to apply pressure. Their strategy was to make the US appear as an outlier, acting alone and in defiance of global consensus. By framing American actions as a blatant violation of international norms and established laws, Europe aimed to rally global opinion against Washington. This narrative was carefully crafted in press conferences, diplomatic cables, and public statements, painting the US as a rogue actor undermining the rules-based order. At the United Nations, Denmark and its European allies took the lead, orchestrating debates and resolutions that forced the US to publicly defend its controversial decisions. The goal was to put Washington on the defensive, making it answer tough questions before the entire international community. Europe pushed for a General Assembly condemnation, seeking a formal rebuke that would further isolate the US diplomatically and symbolically. Beyond the UN, European diplomats worked tirelessly to build a coalition of other democracies, Canada, Japan, Australia, encouraging them to join the opposition. By presenting a united front, they hoped to amplify the pressure and demonstrate that the US was increasingly alone. Within NATO, European members considered freezing military and intelligence cooperation with the US, a dramatic move that would signal deep divisions within the alliance and disrupt its normal operations. Such actions would send a clear message: the alliance could not function as usual while the crisis persisted, and trust in American leadership was eroding. At the same time, European diplomats quietly offered Washington a face-saving exit. Options included mediation by neutral parties, the negotiation of new treaties, or the launch of talks on Arctic governance. These behind-the-scenes efforts aimed to de-escalate tensions and provide the US with a dignified way to step back. This two-track approach, public isolation combined with private negotiation, was designed to resolve the crisis peacefully, avoiding escalation into open conflict or war. Ultimately, the success of this strategy depended on the unity and resolve of European nations, who needed to present a consistent message and avoid internal divisions. Equally crucial was the willingness of the United States to compromise and engage in genuine dialogue. Only through mutual understanding and cooperation could the crisis be resolved for the benefit of all. No matter how the situation unfolds, the US attempt to annex Greenland would send shockwaves through the Transatlantic alliance, fundamentally altering the relationship between America and its European partners. The trust and cooperation that have defined decades of Western unity would be deeply shaken, if not irreparably damaged. Even if the crisis were resolved diplomatically, the sense of betrayal and uncertainty would linger for years, casting a long shadow over future collaborations. In response, Europe would be left with little choice but to pursue genuine strategic autonomy. The continent would accelerate efforts to integrate its defense capabilities, increase military spending, and reduce its reliance on American security guarantees. European leaders would convene emergency summits debating how best to protect their interests in a world where old alliances can no longer be taken for granted. The crisis would transform once controversial ideas, like the creation of a unified European army or a joint nuclear deterrent, from distant possibilities into urgent necessities. What was once discussed in academic circles would now become the focus of real policy, as Europe seeks to ensure its own security and project power on the global stage. On the global stage, the fracture between the US and Europe would embolden rivals such as China and Russia. These powers would seize the opportunity to expand their influence, exploit divisions within the West, and challenge the existing international order. The world would become more unpredictable, with new alliances forming and old ones dissolving, leading to a far more volatile and multipolar environment. In this new reality, alliances would shift rapidly. Middle powers, nations that once relied on the stability of the US-led system, would scramble to forge new security arrangements, seeking partners who can offer protection and support in an increasingly uncertain world. The Greenland crisis would not just mark the end of the US-led order, it would force Europe to finally define its own power, interests, and identity on the world stage. The continent would have to navigate a future where it stands more alone, making choices that will determine its destiny. Ultimately, the decisions made in the aftermath of this crisis would shape the future of international security for generations to come. The world would watch as new strategies are forged, alliances are tested, and the balance of power is redefined.